the point is that you have this like academic side of you, and which is fascinating. You have this crypto guy part of you as which is part investor, still part academic, but you also have this third part of you, which is that you've built companies. So you helped build. This is like traditional. Like this is the most normal part of you, which isn't even normal. Like the most normal part of you helped build like a $50 billion company called Coinbase. So the most normal part of you I used when I'm freezing my embryos, and we just found out that like one of our potential children just had like Down syndrome, and like oh that's the most normal part of you, is that you built that shit, right?
Well, it's funny. It's funny because for your audience, yes, I think that's probably true.
Which is weird because that's not normal, right? And so I guess what I'm curious about is on the Tim Ferriss podcast, you used one of the more baller phrases to say that you're rich. You used post-economic.
I didn't use that phrase. Tim did, but it's a good phrase.
It was the most baller phrase I'd ever heard of, like post-economic, like to the point where money doesn't like you're beyond that. And because I care about money, and it's interesting to me beyond just like you can buy nice shit, but it's like you can think about stuff that you normally wouldn't be able to think about. Has most of your success, financial success, come from this weird part of you that is this crypto investor and got in early, or from the traditional part of building companies? And there's a reason why I'm asking, but I'm curious what the answer is.
I think I'm, I like to think of myself as a pragmatic ideologue, where I have a horizon where I have my eyes set on this long-term goal of transhumanism and transcendence, but then I'm willing to be as pragmatic as possible in the short run and execute and go down to-do lists and so on for that North Star, right? Which I'm always conscious of. And I wake up in the morning and I go to sleep at night and I think about that. And
I think that's
basically
sorry, I was just gonna say, I think that's evident. You kind of proved that when we asked you about 1729, and when you talked about it, you talked about essentially disrupting, education, making it so that when people spend their time online, they're not just frivolously scrolling feeds, they're actually learning and earning and burning calories. But then if you go to the product, it is the V1 kind of crawl where you say, okay, what's the simple building block that we need to do that? Let's send a newsletter every day with a micro task that people can do to learn something and earn a little bit of money. And so I think you embodied that exact idea of like, what's the extreme long-term North Star, and then what is today's building block in order to move forward.
And that's why I was getting like, what the hell are you up to, man? Yeah. What are you doing?
Well, it's funny. It's funny. Well, so let me talk about that for a second. That is absolutely an acquired language where I have learned that you need, Moritz talks about this half jokingly as, every app needs one of the 7 deadly sins, like lust, greed, sloth, gluttony, wrath, pride, and I forget the other ones, right? But I think it's close, right? And so Tinder is lust, right? And Twitter is wrath. And arguably early Google, which is pretty actually, that's pretty highbrow, like search, but arguably that's sloth, and then Uber Eats or DoorDash is gluttony. I love those companies. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to diss any of them, right? So those hooks, basically, I think you need to deliver a visceral, instant benefit to somebody, right? Where in a second you can explain what it is. Okay, a newsletter that pays you, right? Earn Bitcoin for submitting a form in a minute, right? So instant benefit. If you can't give that to somebody instantly, then it's too complicated. Rarely there's exceptions. Rarely there's things that have a very end-loaded benefit. Like things like Ethereum or RomeResearch.com, for example. That rewarded an academic mindset at the beginning. That was very long-term, right? But even Ethereum, for example, there was like a speculative upside. Which was the visceral short-term thing where you could align the short-term mentality with the long-term mentality.
But I have to bring you back to the original question.
Let's bring you back to Earth. Go ahead. Yeah.
I got to bring you back to the original question, which was basically I was asking, I'm like, did you get wealthier from this Bitcoin stuff or from building the company stuff? And I have a reason for asking.
I don't usually like disclose my like percentages or something like that, but let's say I've done well from both. I mean, fortunate from both. It's interesting because as an investor, you have it's 1% or less of the work. It's 10 to 20% of the return, but it's 0% of the control. You know, and I have never been like a tech guy in the sense of actually, there's people who talk about, oh, I had a Commodore 64 really early on, and I was programming, and so on. That was actually never me. I played video games a lot when I was a kid, but I was a math guy, right? That's actually the angle that I came into it from. I was into, math and physics, growing up, and, Feynman lectures and all the type of stuff. And, thought that I was going to be maybe like a stats professor or applied mathematics professor or something like that. And so computers were always just a tool, and business was always just a tool. Only later, the reason I got into genomics or clinical genomics, the reason I did a startup was, and I'll come back to your point. I know you got a thing. The reason I did that was in academia. If you raise $10 million in a grant, raise isn't the right term. You get a $10 million grant, and each row of data costs $1,000 to collect. You can only do 10,000 rows before you run out of money, right? Whereas if you're making even $10 on a row, you can collect a much larger sample and make a much bigger difference for the world, right? Because you can actually do the data analysis on that large sample thing. So the thing is that the 0% control, even though I am an investor and I think I've done fairly well at it and so on, I invest on an ideological basis. I invest in the world that I want to build. And there's probably things which are, good financial investments that, I'm just not interested in something if it's just making money. I can sort of force myself to be in that headspace, but I have to force myself,
Yeah, the reason I was just asking was I just think that you're like supposed to be you're the stereotype of you is that you have all these odd and unique frameworks that create this brilliant ideas, yada yada yada. That's cool. I dig that. But what I was curious about, like, just what's your life philosophy towards certain things, specifically?
How do you think about execution, for example?
Well, it was just like, were you just like, well, I'm just gonna go and like make this company, sell it, get the bag. Now I can do all this crazy wild shit, and everything else is upside. And that's why I'm wondering, because like if that is your strategy, I actually think that's kind of cool because there was some practicality, and then like genius stuff comes out afterwards. And that's what I was curious, like.
In that sense, I'm not capable of. I should say not capable of it. I didn't just do a job for the sake of doing a job to get the money to then do the next thing. I really believed in both, counsel and, crypto and Earn and Coinbase. And so like, that's how I could put in that level of energy. Like, Buffett has this concept of, I don't agree with a lot of his stuff nowadays, actually, but this concept is good. It's like, if you're waiting to do what you want, it's like, waiting to make love at like 70 or something like that. You're just deferring. It just doesn't work like that, right? You should start, working on it now. Thiel also has this concept of how do you achieve your 10-year goal in 6 months, So yeah. I think that what I tried to do is advance short-term goals, maybe a sinuous path, right? Maybe a winding path, but I had that long-term kind of vector that I'm going towards. And so the short-term stuff was never, oh, let me make the money and move on. Maybe that might have been smarter to do. Like D.E. Shaw did something like that, right? Like
D.E. Shaw is the guy who created the hedge fund.
Yeah, the hedge fund, and then he put a ton of the money into protein folding.
Yeah, so like, and Shaw is famous because that's where Bezos worked and was left to join Amazon.
He built out this.
And D. Shaw was like, "Hey, are you sure you want to do this?"
Yeah, exactly, right. So, I mean, there's a lot of effective altruism people who are like this. I would argue that the effective altruism people miss one very important thing, which is that it is the production by people of goods that actually makes them feel that they deserve things. Like if you haven't built, you feel guilt. I think it's a very powerful concept, right? If you haven't built, you feel guilt. So if it's just handed to you, then you don't actually feel like you deserve it. And that leads to a sense that nobody deserves it and everybody's things should be taken down, right? So I I think that emergency aid is actually very good, but like industrialized aid where it fosters a sense of dependency is bad. Easterly and Levine have written about things like this. But recursing back up the stack, they do this concept of, work hard, make a lot of money, and then spend it on altruism, for example, right? And I think that's a reasonable strategy, but I find it like holding your breath, and I only worked on those things that had meaning for me along the way, but were leading to a greater meaning thing. And I've been fortunate enough to do that, by the way. Like one thing I was just mentioning to Sean is that it's hard for me to necessarily give advice to folks on the very macro sometimes, because in many ways the world has just become more Balaji-like. Okay, if you were a person who was a 9 to 5 morning person who liked routine, who liked structure, who wanted to hit the same button every day, who wanted work-life balance and to come home to the family and like have dinner at the same time every night and so on and so forth, the mid-20th century was awesome for you, because that was kind of the peak of centralization, homogeneity, routinization, structure. It was also, by the way, the peak of like mass murder and so on in like China and Russia and whatnot. Both those are related to centralization, but in the US, at least, like a decent quality of life, that was like the best centralized model in the world, right? Whereas the rest of the world wasn't doing so well under that degree of centralization. And now we're kind of in the opposite thing, where it's like favoring night people who are asynchronous, rather than hitting a button, the same button for 20 years at a factory, you're hitting a different key every second, like you're just generating like different information. Your day can be extremely varied. One day, like COVID has kind of locked us inside, but your day online can be extremely varied. Do one thing one day, podcast another day, maybe play a video game, or basically the entire diversity of the human experience is a click away.
And also the you're rewarded now for diversity of thought and opinion in a way that if now that everybody's a content producer, the more differentiated your content, the sort of higher the rewards you get, versus if you're in the previous era, not everybody was a content producer, everybody was a content consumer. You just go home, sit down, watch the box, and if you tried to sort of stray out of line, you weren't necessarily going to find other people who had the same convictions as you. And so, it sort of paid to just toe the party line in a bigger way than it does today, where actually standing out pays more today.
It's interesting because I think we are in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge. Do you know what that was? It's basically like Germany's counterattack in the waning days of the war, which was actually a pretty ferocious counterattack, but ultimately in the long sweep of history was just a counterattack, and the long sweep was there, right? And what I think we have now is a strong counterattack in favor of conformity by both, kind of like the woke contingent and like, CCP, right? And so I think like actually it's going to be quite a fight, because in my model of kind of like these memes and things all battling each other in this gigantic continent, this cloud continent, one of the most powerful memes is a meme that says there shall be no other memes before